Well, thank you for that. I'm very honoured to be here. And I acknowledge, of course, that we're standing on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people, and I offer my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like very much to thank Barry Jones for encouraging me to give this lecture and making it possible, and of course to Barry, who's Stuart, who's also helped organise it and has been very helpful to me. And I'm honoured to be hosted by this law school, of which I've been a part and lectured in this theatre before many times. I'm glad to be back to it. You'll gather that my voice isn't so terrific. It's a condition that I have that sometimes makes it difficult for me to speak, also to stand. So I hope I can manage both tonight. In an essay published almost 20 years ago and republished in the collection Justice and Hope, I distinguished two kinds of hope. By the way, I've asked somebody at the back, Sean McVeigh, actually to shout out if I can't be heard.
You can be heard.
I can be heard, that's good. There are two kinds of hope. One is a trust that one's love of the world, which is not based on weighing the good and evil in it, will survive the many things that can extinguish it. Affliction, of course, one's own or of others being the most likely. I called it an unconditional, though not thereby conditioned, love of the world. The other kind of hope itself takes two forms, neither of them a form of belief, both attitudes to the future. The first is simply the hope that this or that will happen. Its object can be trivial, that the weather is sunny tomorrow, or serious, that one's friends recover from illness, or that there won't be a war. But whether trivial or serious, such hope is episodic. It occurs when occasions prompt it and ceases when one gives up or when there's no more reason for it, when one's friend falls ill and then recovers, for instance. The second of this second form of hope is a continuous orientation of the human spirit to the world. In different ways, both forms are vulnerable to what happens in the future. This second form of hope is one of the deepest expressions of courage, an affirmation of life. Its ability to survive unrelenting disappointment relies to a degree on whether it can sustain faith that the good in the world will defeat the ill in it. It also depends on retaining faith in humankind. It must be able to trust that enough people will remain decent even in the worst of times. In that book and others, I also wrote about different phases of justice. Justice as it might be sought in courts of justice, justice as social justice, and another form of justice, not distinct from the others, but transformative of them, is an unconditional respect for the humanity of others. But the word humanity, as I just used it, is ethically inflected. The content of its inflection and what informs that content will differ according to different ethical conceptions that inform it. It'll be different to those who hear in the affirmation that it'll be different to those who hear in it, that is in the inflection, the affirmation that every human being possesses an inalienable dignity to which is owed unconditional respect, than it is to those who do not, perhaps because they don't possess the concept, or if they do, they don't accept it, or who may, as increasingly many people do, scorn it when certain kinds of evildoers come to mind. The plea that even the most terrible evildoers must be treated as human beings, not as monsters. To that plea, some people will respond that if you want to be treated as a human being, first you must behave like one. Human being in that declaration, that you first have to behave like a human being if you want to be treated like one, is also ethically inflected. It's very important to remember that these ways of speaking of humanity are not references to the species, but rather to ethically inflected ways. Especially important to remember it when people say that that sometimes people are seen as being less than human, or when they speak of a common humanity, or when they might say, be a human being for once in your life. I wrote about hope that's a form of unconditional love of the world because I feared that the second kind of hope that I just sketched was increasingly distant from the hearts of young people. The student protests against Israel's war on Gaza and its people has changed my mind about that. They appear to be protests that, at least for some people or some of its members in the protest or the people in the protest, express joyfully a reaffirmation that political action can change the world. Political action by them can change the world. And I welcome that, though with some qualifications that I sometimes fear will reduce the voice of hope in me to a whisper. So this evening I'll speak about aspects of those protests, which inevitably will mean that I talk about Israel-Gaza. I had not intended to do this when I first agreed to give the lecture, and when indeed I wrote a blurb for it. And I apologise to those who had not expected me to, and might indeed not have come had they known that I would. I decided to do it for two reasons. Justice and Hope is a collection of writings spanning almost 30 years, which for better or for worse made people refer to me as a public intellectual, an expression I dislike. In it there are essays and lectures on war and terror, and one on Israel's invasion of Gaza in 2009. Given the title of my lecture, how could I not talk about something that has, at least in the short term, changed the world? For me now to avoid talking about Israel-Gaza in this lecture under this title would be as weird as not talking about September 11th shortly after it happened, or if that sounds over dramatic, of the invasion of Iraq when that happened. Generally, I'm not keen to declare in sort of declarations of interest in these kinds of circumstances, but there are some I must make because it matters from where I speak. The understanding and discussion of ethical matters is always personal, not in the trivial sense of being an expression of mere opinion, but in a sense that does not compromise a robust sense of trying to see things as they are. Later, I'll discuss why I believe this to be so. I was, as you were told, born in Germany to a German mother, and I have German family that I love. I have a Jewish wife, stepchildren and step-grandchildren. Hardly a day passes when I am not at some level aware that in the lifetime of my parents, most of the nations of Europe were glad to see Jews exterminated like vermin, unfit to live on this earth. My wife is also Israeli. She and I are deeply pained by what Israel has become. Zionism takes many forms, from the evil utterances of some of the members of the Israeli government to the affirmations of anti-state Zionists in the early days, like Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt, who believed that Jews had a need and also a right to political and cultural self-determination in some parts of Palestine, consistent with the intention to help to bring fulfillment, that same need and right for Palestinians. In that sense, I am a Zionist, if you can be one without being Jewish. I do not believe that what Israel has become was inevitable from at least 1948. Between then and now, there are too many roads not travelled, with unknown destinations, unforeseen destinations, roads that were not taken. For people more or less my age, the Holocaust taught two important lessons. First, that no human being, irrespective of what they have done and what they are like, should be treated as vermin, beyond the pale of a sense of a common humanity. That perhaps is why so many preambles to international law speak of the dignity, with a big D, of humanity, of the alienable dignity possessed by all peoples, no matter what their ethnic, religious, or national allegiances. The second, is that because of their allegiances to nation or religion, many good people end up supporting or even participating in slaughter. They defend the indefensible, while others fall silent when they should protest. That's a fact about people across time and places. One of the urgent ethical challenges, therefore, is how to limit that from happening. Many of my writings since at least 2010 have struggled with that question. The student protests are inspired by revulsion at the moral horror of Israel's war against Gaza, knowing in their bones that it is also against its people, if not because it's driven by a genocidal intent, then because it is driven by a fierce desire for revenge that has shown contempt for its victims. Their outrage expresses the belief that nothing that Hamas has done or could realistically threaten to do could justify what Israel has done in response to October 7th. It's not only the number of dead and wounded that motivates them. It's the destruction in Gaza of the conditions for a human life. When you think of how often people have written about how a sense of space, of place, has mattered to them and coloured their entire orientation to the world, their sense of being at home in the world, then you can see what kind of terribleness the physical destruction of Gaza represents. The claim that it is acting disproportionately, even radically disproportionately, is in the wrong ethical space to capture the moral and human awfulness of it. Taken literally, rather than how it is often used in international law, the concept of a crime against humankind does capture it. To defend the conditions of that kind of homelessness in the world, states will do morally terrible things, which is why Israel claims, falsely, that it's fighting a threat to its very existence, and even, absurdly, a threat to Western civilization. When one listens to statements by Israeli political leaders, it's easy to believe that they are out of touch with reality. I won't go into the reasons for thinking that might be so. But against it, it's necessary to appreciate the brutal realpolitik that has long been part of Israel's politics. It's based on the belief that if one can sit out the world's condemnation, there will come a time when the world will no longer care, or not care enough for it to matter. That may indeed be true for older leaders in the West, perhaps even for young people in the West. But it's unlikely to be true of younger people in the global South. Of then Pankaj Mishra wrote, I quote, "Gaza has become, for countless powerless people, the essential condition of political and ethical consciousness in the 21st century, just as the First World War was for a generation in the West." End of quote. On the face of it, I've said enough, I think, to explain why Gaza would have provoked such a fierce moral response rather than the war on Ukraine or the war in Sudan. Russia, after all, is quite clearly guilty of genocide according to the Convention in International Law. But ground for the response to Gaza was prepared long ago by a preoccupation amongst many young progressives in the West with racism and secular colonialism. Palestine attracted a romantic attention of a younger anti-colonial generation in the way that Israel had attracted romantic attention in the 70s, until the 70s. It's now hard to believe that Paul Newman, then one of the most glamorous stars in Hollywood, could play a Haganah officer to tearful admiration. Or that the darlings of the musical world, Jacqueline Dupre and Daniel Barenboim, the darlings of the beautiful people indeed that they were, would marry in Jerusalem at the end of the War of 67. The romance cooled when people suspected that Israel was not indeed keen to relinquish territories captured in 67, as it often proclaimed that it was. And it ended when it became undeniable that it had no intention of doing so, which coincided with a time when people came to know the extent and nature of crimes committed in what Israelis called the War of Independence and the Palestinians called the Nakba. Hamas's intention to provoke Israel into a fierce response that would earn the world's condemnation, and what one can infer from that about its regard for its own people over which it rules, its terrorism against them, its misogyny, homophobia and anti-Semitism, and determination that there be no Jewish political presence in between the river and the sea, has not muted chance of between the river and the sea, Palestine will be free, or made more forceful condemnation of what happened on October 7th. Of course, demonstrations would not exist if participants were too choosy about who marched beside them. But Hamas or its shadow? Such is the ongoing strength of the romance with Palestine, and is partly why people are disinclined to interpret the chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," as consistent with the acceptance of a Jewish presence and political presence in that place. I believe, though, that it's mostly due to thoughtlessness on the part of the demonstrators. I say that more in hope than because I have evidence for it. It's striking, indeed, how hard it is to find evidence about this. And thoughtlessness, of course, can be dangerous. True though that is, the thoughtlessness, if it is that, is not a reason to believe that the demonstrators are, in fact, expressing anti-Semitism. That's a thought that they are expressing anti-Semitism, is often implied in the rhetorical question, why Israel? Why not Sudan or Russia? But the fact that that rhetorical question had some force in the past, when Israel was the only state whose injustices prompted people to say it should not exist, that fact makes it implausible that it should play no role in explaining current hostility, especially given the universally acknowledged rise in anti-Semitism throughout the world. Anti-Semitism is a light sleeper, people have said. Were it not for the definition of anti-Semitism adopted by most European nations, the definition devised by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, were it not for the wide acceptance of that in Europe, the US, and in Australia, and indeed by this university, I would take the following as obvious. One can denounce as criminal the actions and policies of successive Israeli governments while not being an anti-Semite. One can be anti-Zionist while not being an anti-Semite. One can even believe, as some Israelis do, that Jews do not have the kind of identity that can find truthful national expression while not being an anti-Semite. As obviously true as all that should be, however, none of it tells us how often anti-Zionism is an expression of anti-Semitism. Even seriously to put that last question, one must draw a distinction that, as far as I know, has not been made in discussions of these matters. I've tried to impress it on readers, especially since 2010, but to no avail. Undeterred, I elaborate it again this evening because I think it's important. It's a distinction between hostility to Jews as a form of anti-Semitism, that is, as a form of racism, and hostility, more often just irritation, but sometimes it can actually be hatred, of Jews that is conceptually, psychologically, and morally more like anti-Americanism, or when it turns to hatred, more like hatred that Serbs showed to Croats, and vice versa, during the wars in the former Yugoslavia. The difference generally is that when it's more like anti-Americanism, hostility to Jews is in principle answerable to criticism, to correction by facts and by reason, though often it refused to answer to those because overtaken by emotions of one kind or another. Those emotions may be complex, but the conceptual nature of the point is the same as in the simple case when anger makes one resistant to acknowledging facts or reasons to which one again becomes open when one calms down and is able, as we put it, to listen to the voice of reason. The point here is that though the false beliefs in question are held irrationally, and the person who holds them may for a time be deaf to the voice of reason and blind to reality, they are nonetheless, for the most part, genuinely the reasons why they are angry and hostile. Many psychological studies show that racism is not like that. The false claims that racists make about the victims or their denigration are not the basis for their hostility. For that reason, though it's natural, it's nonetheless mistaken to think that racists have the attitudes they do because they're ignorant and irrational. The point, of course, is not that they're knowledgeable and rational. It's that knowledge and ignorance, rationality and irrationality are not at issue here. Study after study shows that racists readily enough abandon their stereotypes, one after the other, moving easily from one to another when under pressure, because they know instinctively that they are rationalizations of how they feel and behave, rather than the real causes of it. To think of racism as a form of irrationality, of the kind displayed by people whose emotions override their reasons, is therefore seriously to misunderstand it. And that is the deep truth in the bitter witticism that if Jews did not exist, anti-Semites would have to invent them. The two forms of hostility are often hard to distinguish from one another because they so often deploy the same stereotypes and because they shade into one another. Nevertheless, I'm certain that many people who sincerely and truthfully deny that they are anti-Semites are to varying degrees hostile to Jews, though they are not anti-Semitic. Because they are not anti-Semites, and because they sincerely believe it will be terrible if they were, decent people are often in denial about their hostility to Jews. The cancellation of Holocaust Memorial Day in Spain as a response to Gaza, and the subdued nature of its observance in England and some European countries was, I think, an expression of hostility to Jews, but not of anti-Semitism. So too, I suspect, are many of the comparisons of Jews to Nazis. I do not know how one should characterize Muslim hostility to Jews. Taken as a form of religious hatred, in this case a hatred of infidels, it's different from anti-Semitism as a form of racism. But like hostility to Jews, that is not a form of racism, it appeals to the same stereotypes that racist anti-Semites do. Should one take it only as a form of religious hatred rather than as a form of religious hatred inseparably mixed with anti-Semitism, as Christian anti-Semitism often was? The answer, I'm reasonably certain, is that one should not. Of course, to Israelis facing the hatred of Iran, Hezbollah and Hamas, who want to cleanse the territory between the Mediterranean River and the sea of most of its Jews, the distinction I have drawn might appear academic. But it's not academic to an understanding of the increasing hostility of the Western intelligentsia to Israel and to Jews. Hostility to Jews that is more like anti-Americanism is responsive to realities it distorts in the way that anti-Semitism is not. Much of the progressive intelligentsia that is now hostile to Israel was hostile to America during the presidency of George W. Bush, not just to this or that policy of his administration, but hostile to America and its people in a way that expressed itself in many sweeping, false and offensive generalizations that were irrationally but sincerely believed. When Barack Obama was elected, that declined markedly. Were Israel to show a serious intent to allow Palestinians political self-determination that was true to the moral and political significance of the Nakba and was therefore not an affront to their dignity, then I'm quite certain that there would be a significant decline in hostility to Jews of the kind that is like anti-Americanism. It would not make anti-Semites less anti-Semitic. That's another aspect of the truth in the observation that if Jews did not exist, anti-Semites would have to invent them. It might, however, make anti-Semites less prepared to express their anti-Semitism so publicly as hostility to Israel. Is this useless hair-splitting, even if it's true? Does it make a difference to someone who's abused as a Jew, made fearful as a Jew? Not at that time, I'm sure. But it does make a difference to what we can hope for and would make a difference to our sense of community to which we belong, to know that what we believe to be an alarming increase in anti-Semitism turned out to be considerably less than we thought, especially if it were established that the hostility to Israel shown by young people in the protests really could be explained just by what Israel has become, together with the fact that so many Jews in the diaspora would not politically condemn what it has become. One reason that the Jewish diaspora has not condemned what Israel has done is because they have not been able to overcome the shock, indeed the intergenerational trauma of what was done on October 7th. It was not just the terrorist killing of civilians, including children and babies. It was not just the brutal sexual violence. Nor was it the fact that more Jews were killed on a single day than at any time since the Holocaust, though of course all these things were fundamental to that trauma. It was because these things were done with undisguised Jew hatred. And that, I think, was the shock that went through the diaspora communities throughout the world. And that trauma was compounded by equivocation about its moral and political significance, and even sometimes the denial of any sympathy. When the chief of the UN said in a tone of frustration that people, and he meant mostly Jews, must see that, I quote, "this did not come from nowhere," end of quote, they took him to mean that they should see the deeds of October in a historical context, and they took that to mean that they were being asked to see some justification in it. He angrily denied the latter. The "this" to which he referred was obviously October 7th, but he ran together the particularity of that attack with Palestinian terrorist attacks more generally. Many who describe the acts of October 7th as acts of resistance did the same. It should be obviously true that the one and the same action can fall under many descriptions. An act of terror can also be an act of resistance. Some terrorists are freedom fighters. Some freedom fighters are terrorists. And it's important to note that some terrorists who would be freedom fighters forfeit the right to the heroic resonances of that expression and the heroic resonances of resistance fighters. They forfeit it because of the way they have acted. At least some of the Hamas fighters forfeited it by how they acted, even if they were freedom fighters when they broke through the fence. They forfeited it not because they killed civilians, or even because they killed children, perhaps, but because of the rapes, and worse than rapes. How much history and contextualization does one need in order to know that? If one wants to understand, as of course one should, what they did, then what is needed is not just reference to the occupation or to the daily suffering and humiliation of Palestinians. One needs a political psychology of the kind Adam Schatz offered in a fine article in the London Review of Books on the pathology of vengeance. But that's not what most people had in mind when they talk of history and context. There's something else that's important to remember here. Sometimes in the face of evil, some people ask, how could it be possible that this could be done? That expression of bewilderment is not because they don't have an explanation, a natural explanation of the deed. They may know that a person, for example, was a coward and refused to obey orders to do something terrible. This kind of bewilderment and incredulity, I believe, is the generality of it in human life, is part of what makes us speak of moral terribleness as a distinctive kind of terribleness. People who are blind to this kind of response have an impoverished conception of the impoverished conception of the morally terrible. Sorry, I muffed that a bit. What I want to say is that kind of incredulity, how could they do this? Which is a general fact often in human life that people express it, is part of our very concept of the morally terrible deeds to which they are responding. That's the point I want to make. And an analogy here might help. Many people are bewildered by the disappearance of a human personality in death, are in some sense incredulous that the person is no more. They know the facts of science and do not believe they need to be supplemented by supernatural facts. This kind of bewilderment is partly constitutive of our idea that human beings are unique and irreplaceable, not just to those who love them, but unique and irreplaceable, period. Some of the aggressive calls to see the atrocities of October 7 in context looked like an uncompromising assault on this aspect of October 7, and not just to Jewish people. That said, however, I believe it is a moral tragedy for the Jewish diaspora that it has not been able to transform its trauma into an urgent need to criticize the horrors that Israel had perpetrated in their name. The same is true, of course, of the citizens of Israel. The response to that lament has been, over many years, from Jewish people, why should we join the critics of Israel? There are plenty of them without us. The answer to that, it seems to me, is that just as nothing in the past was comparable to October 7, nothing Israel has done in the past, not even during the Nakba, is comparable to what it has done since October 7 and continues to do. At least during the 15 years of Netanyahu's government, it must have seemed to many Palestinians that armed resistance was the only option open to them if they were to realise their aspiration to self-determination. Because it would obviously be useless to take up arms against the IDF, armed resistance would therefore have to take the form of terrorism, by which I mean, for the purposes of this lecture, I don't want to generalise beyond it, the killing of civilians with the purpose of terrorising the community to which they belong to achieve a political end. At least some of them will see that conclusion to be one horn of a moral and political dilemma. One does something morally terrible, no matter what one does. Whatever they do, they will be remorseful. That is, carry the burden of the pain of knowing what they have done and become in the doing of it, even though they know they will do it again, for so long as political circumstances require it. I don't think of remorse as an emotion consequent upon one's belief that one has done something morally terrible. I take it as a bewildered, pained recognition, pained understanding of the meaning of what one has done to one's victim and to what one has become by doing it. Faced with competing moral imperatives, the terrorists I am thinking about will not wonder whether what they are doing is justified. With all the moral seriousness they can muster, they will attend to the reasons that speak for one or the other course of action, and then they will act, or fail to act, crippled by the moral awfulness of their situation. It's of the nature of a moral dilemma that if one later takes the other horn of it, that does not necessarily mean that one has found new considerations that speak more strongly than they had done previously. I must, but I cannot. That is the form of the dilemma. And these are expressions of ethical necessity and impossibility. Modalities usually different from obligation. Many people find it incoherent, or find incoherent the idea that one could be remorseful for a deed one believes one is morally compelled to do, or that one could be genuinely remorseful without repudiating the deed that occasions it. But the reasons typically offered to support the charge of incoherence are not written in the heavens. They are not conceptual truths about remorse or morality more generally. They are the expressions of a moralistic squint on what counts as morality, a squint caused by preoccupations with the categories of praise, blame, condemnation, rebuke, justification. The kind of Palestinian terrorist I'm thinking of, I have no idea how many of them actually exist or have existed, act as they do because they hope that they can bring nearer the day when Palestinian people will enjoy all the human and political goods that only self-determination can bring. Some Jewish terrorists acted for that reason to create a space for a Jewish homeland in part of Mandate Palestine. That was then, as the Palestinian struggle is now, an existential struggle in the sense that at stake then and now is the existence of a certain kind of political space, to bring it into existence rather than to protect it against destruction. States have always been prepared to act against morality and law when the existence of the nation and the political and cultural life of its people is at risk of destruction. Their leaders and the people they govern take that to be a responsibility intrinsic to the ethical imperatives of their vocation. To demand in the name of morality that Palestinians renounce terror is to demand that they affirm the Socratic principle that it is better to suffer evil than to do it. No state will do that. It is a fundamental principle of morality, and I believe of the law of war, that soldiers can kill in wartime while respecting the humanities of those they kill, and that the understanding of this by their victims can make their victims consent to it. I'm not an international lawyer, but I suspect that is why international humanitarian law does not judge the justice of the cause of those who fall under its law. It assumes that in most wars, combatants will believe their cause to be just, or perhaps more often, fight for reasons, because their friends are fighting, for example, consistent with what Orwell called ordinary decency. I'm sympathetic to the fear that this humane, non-moralistic perspective will be eroded if the laws of war go beyond judging the way war is fought to judging the justice of going to war. The laws of war prohibit the killing of civilians except in certain strictly limited circumstances when they forfeit the protection of the law. I would not wish to be taken to be recommending that should change. But I strongly disagree that it is incoherent to believe that one can kill civilians who have taken no part in combat, who are, as we say, innocent civilians, while at the same time fully respecting their humanity, believing they possess an inalienable dignity to which an unconditional respect is owed. As I said earlier, I do not know how often that happens. Probably rarely, and perhaps as rarely in conventional war bound by the laws of war. But that doesn't alter its standing as a moral requirement on perpetrators and a moral hope for their victims, a hope that they are able to find it in themselves to consent to it. That cannot be said of the perpetrators or the victims of October 7th, nor the perpetrators of the crimes in Gaza, not those who gave the orders or those who carried them out. Is this a justification for terrorism? Should I not at least say that terrorists should not do what they do if I agree that what they do is morally terrible? I wouldn't, not of the terrorists I've portrayed. I do not doubt the seriousness of my moral seriousness of my hypothetical terrorists. I don't fault the reasons that take them to a particular horn of their dilemma. I know that to say that they should renounce the path of terror is to deny them what all states that condemn them will in fact do. I would not say to them, don't you see, don't you understand what it is to make innocent civilians your target? For reasons I've already sketched, I don't believe that the most salient moral categories to reflect upon or to deploy when one is confronted with morally terrible deeds are always condemnation or rebuke. The refusal of those concepts in service to an understanding of the deeds that are morally terrible does not entail excusing them. Otherwise, of course, you wouldn't call them morally terrible. Why is this important, even if I admit that most terrible terrorists are probably not, as I've described my hypothetical ones? Almost certainly there'll be more terrorism in the world in the future. It is therefore important to place the forms of it at the right places in the ethical, political, conceptual landscape. Journalists and some students have likened their current protest to the 1960s and early 70s. The reasons for doing so are obvious. but there's a fundamental difference to be noted. In the 60s and 70s, institutions called universities regarded themselves as answerable to an historically deep conception of a university, which governed deliberation about what was possible or not possible to do consistently with that concept. It included, of course, what could or could not be done in speech or in action in the name of free speech in a university. Now, none of the institutions that are called universities do that. When they deliberate about what courses or even faculties they will support, the concept of a university that is even remotely continuous with the one to which students and staff appealed in the 60s never enters their consideration. If they were to do, as some have done, acts, philosophy, classics, physics, or even entire faculties of humanities, they would not be moved by arguments that institutions lacking those disciplines or faculties do not deserve to be called universities. If anybody my age were to offer such an argument, it would betray that they had been asleep for at least the last 40 years. And it would not occur to younger people to do it because the concept died before many of them were even born. Admittedly, even in the 60s, the argument didn't have much life in it. Responding to the demand that, quote, there must be the most serious consequences for students who endorse terrorist groups such as Hamas, including possible expulsion. In response to that, Vicky Thompson, chief executive of the group of 8 elite universities, said, and I quote, "The group of 8 universities completely understands that these phrases are deeply offensive, hurtful and distressing, and we would prefer that they were not used. But the fact remains that they're not unlawful, and police are not and have not taken any action when they are used in a multitude of fora across the nation. That doesn't make them less hurtful. However, until such time as they breach the law, we have little recourse to their use. What we would do is call upon those using that language to reconsider using phrases demonstrably hurtful and distressing." End of quote. What she said could, for the most part, be said of the code of conduct of any corporation, though, of course, there would seldom be the need to say it. Her statement implies that institutions that are now called universities should not provide space for speech or action that is unlawful. But it was essential to the concept of the universities as it was held in the 1960s and early 70s that universities were institutions that would, in many circumstances, protect students and staff from the law when what they said or did was unlawful. Of course, they recognised that as citizens, they were probably justifiably liable to arrest off campus. Nobody suggested that the values of the civitas should be the same as the values of the university, that what should count as freedom of speech and political activities on campus should apply in the wider society. But that is why there was an outcry when police came onto the campus of this university to address draft resistors. The resistance to police presence on the US campuses was not, I think, just a reaction to the alleged brutality of the police. It was motivated, in part, by knowledge of a concept possessed and used in similar situations over 50 years earlier. Memory of it could still have effects, but it couldn't speak. As things stand, our life with language can give it no voice. If they cannot speak of the serious concept of university, to what can students and staff appeal when they ask what should be permitted on campus? I don't know exactly, and I wouldn't have time anyhow to explore it this evening. but here is a rough answer. Students should be permitted to say in public fora on campus what they have come to believe in discussions in classrooms. They should, therefore, be prepared to be permitted to say with Machiavelli, the political leaders should not desire to be good, and they should love their country more than their soul. They should be permitted to say with Frantz Fanon that the oppressed can legitimately use political violence against their oppressors. With Marx, that we should aim for revolution. And with many contemporary writers, that Israel is through and through an irredeemably a racist colonial settler state and should cease to exist as a Jewish state. So it should even be permitted to say that Hamas's actions on October 7th were justified, all things considered, given what provoked them and what they achieved, with regrettable collateral damage. Or to be able to say, because of its Eurocentric character, international law has favoured the colonial exploitation of people in the global south and therefore lacks the authority to claim adherence to it. I'm not saying I agree with any of these things, I'm just sketching things I believe should be permitted to be said and to a degree acted upon. The expression of these views will create offence and hurt, even fear. But if they are views that explicitly or implicitly students are invited to assess in the class with a serious possibility that they might accept them and take them into their lives, then the institutions that teach them should allow expression of them in speech and in some kinds of action, even if both are against the law. There is a qualification, of course, that speech and action be consistent with the respect owed to others in an institution of learning. Some who refuse this as impossible because the tensions that exist in discussions about Gaza, Israel, are often tensions caused by the fact that participants in those discussions have had family killed. People who believe that such respect is impossible should then be told to join protests on the streets, but not on campus. The requirement to allow certain forms of speech and action, as I've just outlined it, derives from considerations about what it is seriously to teach, not from the idea of a university. Nothing in the identity of corporate universities would prevent them from axing classes or even faculties if they created problems for them with donors or with government. We've seen that in the US. Of course, there are reasons why they would be embarrassed to do this, but they are not reasons that can be derived from the fact that they are called universities, or, I suspect, from anything essential to their corporate identity. It has always, I think, been a conceit on the part of institutions that were called universities, even when the concept meant something, to believe they could teach students to be seriously critical thinkers. They can teach students what the facts of some matter are, how to weigh facts in support of a conclusion, how to argue in the sense in which philosophy departments teach people to be good at argument. But they cannot, in anything like the same way, teach the virtues of courage and humility and others, necessary to care for truth more than the opinion of one's peers, or for status, or because one fears to follow an argument or evidence that would overthrow cherished ideas. That was at the best of times. But even to the extent that such virtues could be taught, or anyhow be possessed by some students, because of the enormous pressures on them to produce certain kinds of results, Universities now actually put obstacles in the way of developing those virtues and their enactment. In the current New Yorker, Sadie Smith praises what she believes to be the courage of staff and students in the 60s, who, she said, risked their careers, even their livelihood, for the cause. I don't remember that we had much to fear. As everyone knows, they were optimistic times, whose recurrence contemporary students don't even dare dream of. I don't remember fearing anything as I sat in the Vice-Chancellor's office of this university, protesting against the university's connections to Honeywell, a company that manufactured anti-personnel bombs with nylon slivers that could not be detected in X-rays. I don't think students who are now occupying buildings could be as insouciant about the consequence of what they're doing as I and my fellow students were. Nor can universities teach in the same way that they teach judgment about factual matters or how to argue, the kind of sensibility necessary to understand the meaning of things in our lives, a sensibility in which feeling and thought are inseparable, and which informs efforts to try to see things as they are, as opposed to how they appear, about all questions about the meaning of things in our lives, including, of course, ethical questions, questions about the nature of love, of virtue, of what counts as sobriety in political action, of what is needed to become resistant to the enchantment of rhetoric that moves us because we have no ear for tone, or for what rings false because it appeals to our dispositions to pathos or kitsch. Such a sensibility requires that we have the courage and the humility to make ourselves answerable to what I have dubbed a call to seriousness. Come now, how can you say that? Do you take me for a fool? Think. Why do you rush so quickly from one conclusion to another, thought to another? Why are you so complacent about your vulnerability to charismatic speakers, to sentimentality and pathos? Why are you so often tone deaf when so-and-so is speaking? And so on. To rise to such a call is to rise in what I've called an individuating responsiveness to what one has made of oneself, to speak out of a life that one has lived as one's own and no one else's. After such a call, participants in conversation cannot know where it will take them. And that is why I said earlier that understanding about the meanings of things in our lives is personal, but not in the way that compromises a serious concern to see things as they are. It's possible to profess skepticism about truth if one is inclined to think an appeal to it invites a capital T. I mean possible in the sense that one can be skeptical of truth in that sense without being a dilettante. It is, however, hard to see how one can dispense with the concept of trying to see things as they are, and its ally of trying to resist one's vulnerability to believe things because one has been wrongly persuaded to do so. But to do this, one must have the courage and the humility to make oneself answerable to the discipline of a call to seriousness. Hannah Arendt wrote about the way in which a certain kind of thoughtlessness can allow evil to be done. She knew, of course, that people could be thoughtless and yet be very intelligent. Albert Camus said, and I've been often fond of quoting this, he said, I admire intelligence, but I distinguish two kinds of intelligence from one another. Intelligent intelligence and stupid intelligence. Stupid intelligence can be formidable, intimidating, quick on its feet. It can take you deservingly to the highest reaches of academic life and to international fame. But it is not thereby thoughtful. It cannot take you to wisdom or even to a serious desire to see things as they are. It can't take you to the virtues necessary for seriously critical thought, thought that constantly reflects on its assumptions. One of the most urgent ethical challenges, therefore, is to try to understand how to create the conditions that could lead to, or at least would remove the obstacles from, intelligent intelligence, to allow intelligent intelligence, and therefore thoughtfulness, as Arendt conceived of it, to flourish. Thank you.